So the International Rescue Committee is an INGO, and we are a humanitarian-based organization. We are based in over 30 countries all over the world and globally, and our main aim is to serve people in different areas. So we work in the areas of health, protection, economic recovery, and also in governance.
Right, I do know the IRC usually releases an emergency watch list, and we've seen there's one for 2024. Can you give us a bit more details of the countries that are at risk this particular year?
So maybe Fatia to take a step back and just say exactly what the watch list is. So for over the last 10 years, the IRC, the International Rescue Committee, has been producing an annual report that looks at the 20 countries that are most risk of global humanitarian need. And what is most interesting, so we look at different indicators to see what 20 countries should we focus on, and we use this as a policy and communication tool. Right. The 2024 watch list has Sudan at the top of it, and then followed by the Palestinian territories, and then thirdly, South Sudan. Something else that stands out in this watch list report is that in Africa, 8 out of the 20 countries are actually from Africa, and you have most of them falling in the top 10 watch list. Right. The report basically highlights the scale of humanitarian needs. So if you think about it globally, we have over 300 million people in need of humanitarian aid, meaning they rely on humanitarian aid. 86% of the countries, 86% of these 300 million fall in the 20 countries that are in the watch list. And this is just a very small population of the whole world. So the 20 countries in the watch list contain just 10% of the world's population. So in addition to Sudan and South Sudan, we have countries like Somalia, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and all these are countries that have faced conflict, climate crisis, and are having displacements.
Right. If I look at the numbers, especially a country like Somalia, there's been flooding issues, 4.3 million people are displaced. Yeah. So from where you sit, what are some of the emergent response that you've put in place?
So some of the things that we've done for Somalia. So Somalia is a country that has had protracted crisis, and one of the things that we are seeing in this country is just the convergence of climate risks and crisis and the conflict. So it makes it very difficult to sort of address, because you're dealing with multiple issues in one country. So some of the things that we are doing is working on health strengthening, and this is just working with the various governments to make sure that we have access to the people who have been displaced, to support them. We are also just looking at protection issues, and this is just looking at the issue of women and girls, and working in the education sector as well, within the region, and then on governance and working with governments in just terms of strengthening their systems to make sure that services are delivered.
Another country, of course, that is in conflict and is actually top on the list is Sudan. Can you tell us about the situation there and the response that you've put in place?
So Sudan is, as you said, it tops the list. Last year, Somalia was top of the list, and you can see right next to it is Palestine. And why Sudan is topping the list? Because since April 15th is when the war broke out in Sudan. And basically you have the Sudan Armed Forces and the RSF, which is the Rapid Support Forces, that have been clashing. And in a period of less than 8 months, we've had the numbers of people displaced double. And then the other thing that we are seeing is multiple actors coming into this, and we're seeing a bit of international interference within the war in Sudan. We've had even our own staff, and other NGOs are having their own staff having to be moved even twice, so it's becoming very difficult. So if you see where the war started in Sudan last year, it started in Khartoum, and this has spread to different regions, and just more recently in December, it spread to Madani, making humanitarian access very difficult. But we're still there, we're still trying to service the people, and again, we're still working in the areas of first of all, just making sure that people can access their basic needs, because obviously water, sanitation become really basic needs for these people who are facing war. And so what we are trying to do is just, provide that sort of need. We have mobile clinics that we place in various areas that we're able to access, bringing in pharmaceuticals. They recently also had an outbreak of cholera and measles, so trying to deal with that. But also just trying to be the voice of Sudan, and even through a watch list, using this as a tool to just communicate the issues that are happening within Sudan and the region. And I think what complicates Sudan is just the overspill within the region. Yeah. So if you look at the numbers of people displaced, both internally and externally, we have about 7 million people who have been displaced. And part of these displacements have moved into Chad. So you have 600 people who have spilled over into Chad, and you have people who have spilled over into South Sudan. And you will notice that South Sudan is third on our list. So South Sudan had broken off from Sudan back in 2011 and still struggling with its own issues, and yet is having to deal with displacements from Sudan. So we are trying to target the areas that we can best support, but being very cautious in how we go protecting our own stuff, but it's also just very difficult because of the access.
You've talked about protecting your own stuff, and I know some of the challenges sometimes when humanitarian agencies are going into conflict areas, people are not necessarily receiving them well. Has IRC, received that there?
So as IRC, I mean, we flag ourselves as an NGO, and we work with others. We work with the humanitarian coordination units. We work with the UN in terms of just protection. And we come across as a neutral people. Some of our staff are nationals, and we give them the leeway. If a staff is not feeling safe to be in country, then we assist them to move to various points. But then I think at the soul heart of service is doing as much as we can when we're in country. Like in the case of Sudan, we've had to sort of back out and move. Right now, we've had to move out several times to Port of Sudan and see what sort of services that we can access from there. But then, as you say, the humanitarian workers are really exposed. South Sudan actually, for a long time, was topping the list in terms of just the humanitarian workers who have been exposed. And it becomes a very dangerous place for humanitarian workers to operate in.
Right. Maybe from your observation, I mean, we've seen there's been recently, drought has been a key issue, especially in Horn of Africa. How has the emergency response been from IRC's point of view?
Yeah, it's quite difficult to talk about drought without talking about climate change. Right. And I think we are in a stage where we're in a climate crisis, and you saw the COP28 address this towards the end of last year in Dubai. And countries like Somalia, for example, have faced 5 consecutive seasons of no rain, and immediately after that they were hit by El Nino. And that means the impact of drought usually just exposes the degree to which countries are very vulnerable. When you think about just the bigger picture of climate change, these countries are carrying a disproportionate burden in terms of the climate change, because 2% of the countries in our watch list contribute just 2% to carbon emissions. Yet, when you start looking at climate financing, there's very little money that is going into these countries, and it becomes a strain. So one of the things that we recommend, the recommendations that we are making is twofold. One is that we need to just work, the climate crisis is here, so we cannot only work on climate mitigation, but we need to work on climate adaptation. And therefore we are pushing for the climate financing fund to increase, so that the money that is coming through the UNs and other organizations is focusing on that. And why we're talking about climate adaptation is because we need to be on the prevention side, as well as strengthening just the communities to be able to adapt and become more resilient, because this has really weakened the communities. I mean, we were talking to a pastoralist, and she was saying, you have a season of drought, and then when the flood comes, the animals are too weak to fight it. But even it's in more stable countries like Kenya, we saw towards the end of last year, again, El Nino had hit the northern part. And people again were struggling. And it's like a news flash. They come up in the media and then they disappear, but these communities have to just keep building and trying to form livelihoods and get access to. And what we've seen with flooding again is just the spread of diseases and epidemics, imagine.
Sometimes we see a lot of leadership problems also lead to this kind of conflicts in region. So working for humanitarian organization, has the governments or leadership in those particular countries supported you in any kind of way?
So we aim to work very closely with government, and where we can, we always involve government in what we are doing. But one thing that we have noticed in terms of Africa is that we are having, the conflicts are protracted. and it's becoming very difficult to engage with the government of the day because there's no government of the day.
Right.
So what we try to do is we will work with government, but where it's difficult, we will find a way around of working with the communities in order to access them. But as you say, it's we are seeing also impunity towards the humanitarian law because there's a lack of respect to the humanitarian law, the regional bodies, and sort of what we're saying is the increase in the military, in this militia actors who are fueling the crisis. And so it becomes very difficult even to engage at any governmental level. So what we do is just, we still have some funding that goes into governance, and we just see what are some of the contextual analysis that we can do to inform the work that we are doing and try and come up with scenarios to see how best we can respond. And things like the watch list help us as a tool to sort of do our own scenario analysis.
Talking about the watch list, is there a specific trend you've seen when it comes to humanitarian crisis generally in the continent?
Yes. So more generally, I think it's one is the one we've talked about, the convergence of crisis and climate. And I think with that, we see the displacements and we see the outbreak of diseases. I think just to add to areas that I haven't mentioned, maybe one is just around the women and girls. And if you think about crisis, it's the women and girls who are getting displaced. The men and the boys are taken up as fighters. And so what this does is there's very little emphasis on how can we support the way you meet women who are pregnant and traveled for days and their children are facing malnutrition. The other impact that we are seeing is on education. Most of the children in the watch list countries have barely been in school. I think we speak to about people who have been in school just 5 years, and that's not sufficient education to keep them going and to get a livelihood. And the other trend that we are seeing also is just, again, with the epidemics, and one of the things that worsened this was the COVID pandemic that happened 2 to 3 years ago, and we're still seeing the impacts of that. And then just the protracted crisis. So if you think about some countries have actually been at war for about 7 years. That's a very long time. But another underlying feature is just the economic and the debt. So countries are carrying a very heavy debt burden. It's becoming difficult for countries to respond even to the poverty that is within the country. And the interest rates are going high, the cost of living is going high. And so when you look at stable countries, then you start seeing people becoming uneasy about the cost of living. And again, that can sort of like push the crisis in a different direction.
Right. Let's talk about awareness. Is there a way your organization creates awareness to people in different countries in a way of just protecting themselves, preventing certain issues from happening?
Yeah, I mean, we use various tools for awareness, and we try and contextualize it to the different regions. So obviously social media is becoming a big thing, and we create awareness with social media, but also just trying to localize it and use the communities. Most of the African settings and the African cultures would work through the community elders. So in Somalia, we work through, like, you have your clans and you have your elders. So it's trying to get into the depth of the community and seeing what works for specific countries to create that level of awareness, and using even the health centers when people come together. That's an opportunity to educate people on issues. So it's used every available channel through our various sectors. And what we're trying to do is integrated implementation of our programs, so that we're not just doing standalone programs, but we're trying to see how we can integrate and make sure that we are getting the most out of our programs.
Are you also working with, non-state actors or just collaborating with other organizations when it comes to humanitarian aid?
So it's important because you cannot work in isolation. I mean, 300 million people is not something that we can tackle alone as IRC, but yes, we are part of various coordination bodies, and we work with other INGOs, and we are constantly, sharing information. We also, we work with the UN, and we also work with the donors. Something else that we also doing now is just to work with people who are coming new into the field. So we have Gavi funding a very big program in this region in 4 countries around just immunization. So we are getting new players, and we're starting to see other organizations taking an interest in just the plight of humanitarian within the region.
Are there any specific successes or success stories that maybe you could highlight for us that IRC has been involved in, especially in Africa?
So especially in Africa, I think, so maybe just to start with the global picture that we have reached, 33 million people as an IRC. And this is something that we take pride in. And we have grown and we are present in many countries. So one of the things that we do take pride in is our presence. And you will find IRC offices in various areas of where we reach. And then if you look at some of our health programs, we have targets in terms of just our support to immunization and nutrition, and those are areas that we've reached. We continue to prioritize. One of the challenges that we are facing is just the reducing funding. And if you look at the UN funding it's getting funded up to 30 to 40%, so it's not sufficient, but we're just trying to look at innovative ways. In terms of climate change, something we take pride is in anticipatory action. So there's a program that we run in Nigeria which anticipatory action basically means thinking about what's coming your way and how can you prevent this. So we ran a program in Nigeria, and that was a huge success in terms of just trying to help the communities prepare for things like drought and famine.
Right. How does the IRC address long-term development and sustainability in addition to immediate humanitarian needs?
So we have a strategy. We call it the Strategy 100. IRC is a very old organization. It was established by Albert Einstein almost 90 years ago, and we are headed to a 100-year mark. And so we've been around for a long time, and we are learning lessons, and we're collecting these lessons and trying to put them into a strategy. So we've put this into a strategy that we are working, and we have certain objectives that we are working towards. With our strategy, we have been able to identify what areas that we can or cannot work with, and so we become very established in terms of where we put our offices, and also just upskilling our staff to make sure that they are able to serve in various regions. We have a lot of frontline staff who work in the actual camps, the displacement camps, and they are able to, interact with the people who are closest to the need to inform us in terms of our strategy. And so we're being innovative. We're developing ourselves on a daily basis, and the thinking is going into this. And if you look at just the package of our programs, they're complementary. So that helps us just reach our goals.
Right. Just now, in terms of, coming back home here in Kenya, are there any specific projects IRC is involved in the country at the moment?
Yes, so we do have projects in Kenya, and at the moment we're in both Dadaab and Kakuma, and again just in the same sectors of health, protection, and just governance and system strengthening. But also we have a project that's dealing with urban refugees right here in Nairobi, which we call the Rebuild. So because one of the things that we've taken note of is that not only do we have refugees in the camps, but we have refugees within the cities. So that program is working with refugees within the city, and is working in Kenya and also Uganda. So one of our strengths is that we work across countries and across the borders. And the other programs that we have is and just to talk about it, in the region, we have a program that's funded by LEGO, which is our education program, and just helping the kids just learn through play, and just interact with the LEGO bricks that we've been using growing up. And then again, just talking through, just working with government and then state actors, just to strengthen our objectives.
Is there any long-term solution when it comes to humanitarian aid, or just making sure that there's assistance throughout from government, from the local communities?
It's a dream we wish for, that we would hope for longer term. And as I said, one of the challenges that we're facing is that we get a lot of short-term funding. And I think with the economic dips, we've been having the funding going up and down. And therefore, one of the things that we've recommended within our watch list is we need to think about sustainability. We need to think about building resilience so that these things that we are doing are not on an ongoing basis. But as a humanitarian organization, we have to deal with the areas that are greatest at need. And I think we have to bring together the humanitarian angle and the development angle so that these two elements are working. So development looks at, if you think about the countries that have been in a lot of crisis, it's going to take time to build back the economic structures, the infrastructure that they need to. And so we have to combine development and humanitarian. And therefore, just back to the point that we cannot do this in isolation, and then we need the development actors on the table so that we can push forward.
Right, as we wrap up the interview, maybe, because I know on your website there's a lot of predictions usually for the year. So what should we expect this year from IRC in line with the conflicts that are happening in the region?
So what we should expect from IRC, I mean, we're going to use the 20 watch list countries just as an area of focus. So we've put a lot of our efforts into Sudan, and that's carried out through most of last year. And we're going to just be looking at the countries that need the most resources. We're having to do a lot of prioritization internally just to make sure that that we're speaking and we're reaching to the countries that need the support that is required. We are going to approach this again from a people perspective, just looking after our own staff and just making sure that they're in the right places, and we're looking internally at our resources, but also just, working with other people within and other partners and other stakeholders, which is not just government, but it's the donors, it's the UN and everyone else.
Right. All right, thank you for the conversation.